As Lieutenant Colonel Goins mentioned, I'm going to be presenting my thesis that I wrote for my LLM program this past year, the real cost of 5G technology. Just upfront, the mandatory disclaimer that we give, this briefing is for information only. No U.S. government commitment to sell, loan, lease, co-develop, or co-produce defense articles or provide defense services is implied or intended. In accordance with 5 CFR section 3601.108, the views presented herein are my personal views and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. So brief overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to first talk about what is 5G and go over some of the threats of 5G implementation. We'll then talk a little bit about China's growing influence in the 5G infrastructure and standard setting organizations. And we'll also talk briefly about some of China's perceptions in cyberspace, or our understanding of China's perceptions of cyberspace. Then we'll talk about the current status of the cyber response, both internationally and on the domestic front. And then we'll move on to the proposed solutions that I present in my thesis, which include reforms to the Budapest Convention, increasing US participation in international standard setting organizations, some reforms to our own domestic organizational structure, as well as the need for increased private sector cooperation. So first, what is 5G? It's the 5th generation mobile network. It's essentially the new global wireless standard. We're probably all familiar with 4G and 3G before that, and before that we had 2G and 1G. Essentially, we have a new generation of wireless technologies and wireless standards that are developed roughly every 10 years. So it's been about 10 years since 4G, so we have 5G on the horizon coming into play now. And 5G is a new type of network that connects things and people on an unprecedented level. It's going to deliver higher gigabytes per second data speeds, ultra low latencies. It's supposed to be more reliable, have an increased network capacity, and it includes some new things that weren't present in previous generation, which include machine type communication, which is essentially an increased ability of devices to communicate and exchange information without human operation. So a good example of that is self-driving cars, as well as the Internet of Things, which is connecting more and more devices to the internet and allowing people to control them remotely. So, your thermostat, even, your lights, the locks on your house, refrigerators, pretty much everything that we use on a regular basis is being connected to the internet now. And 5G is going to increase our capacity to do that with more efficiency. So some of the threats of 5G implementation, the Department of Homeland Security has targeted 4 discrete areas of risk and vulnerability related to developing and implementing 5G technology. So first we have issues with deployment itself. One of the major differences, in addition to what we've already discussed between 4G and 5G, is the spectrum utilization of each system. 4G utilized the low end of the radio spectrum, whereas 5G is going to utilize the full signal spectrum, which improves speed, but also means using those higher frequencies is going to have a lower ability to cover distances and penetrate walls. So this is going to require a greater number of cell towers and base stations, especially in cities. So increasing the number of stations and networks that we have is going to increase that risk of manipulation and disruption of equipment. So deployment itself is one of the major threats of 5G implementation. We also have pending issues with network security. Network security can be broken down into 3 main components: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality means that data should not be released to unauthorized persons. Integrity means that data is going to maintain its accuracy and consistency from point to point without being manipulated. And availability ensures that all information systems will be functional and accessible at all times. Now with 5G, there are some specific issues. 5G systems have demonstrated particular vulnerability to authentication and key agreement attacks, which essentially allow hackers to determine the subject's location and activities by establishing fake base stations. So they establish a fake station that a cell phone can hook up to, which allows that hacker to then determine what that person is doing, where they are in their activities. And so the national security implications of this are clear if we had a fake base station established near a military installation, and hackers were allowed to track movements of key personnel. There are some clear security issues there. With availability, we have issues with DDoS attacks or distributed denial of service attacks, which we've already seen with our 4G networks. Essentially what a DDoS attack is overwhelming and crashing servers to prevent services from being accomplished. So while DDoS attacks are fairly common now, as we discussed, that increased use of Internet of Things, that increased connectivity and network capacity is going to make 5G systems even more vulnerable to these types of attacks. Finally, we have competition and choice as well as supply chain. Competition and choice is essentially interoperability and standards development. And we'll talk about these last two factors a little bit more on the next slide. So China has stepped up with this 5G surveillance. They've really taken a large portion of 5G essential patents. They've increased their participation in international standard setting organizations so that some of their technologies have been adopted by these organizations as the global standard. And most of where we see China's growing influence is in the company Huawei. Huawei operates in more than 170 countries. It was involved in building the global network for 4G, and it has now signed more than 40 commercial contracts with nations around the world to build 5G infrastructure. So Huawei and other Chinese companies, they own about 36% of all 5G standard essential patents. In the US, on the other hand, Qualcomm is our biggest contributor, and they have about 14% of standard essential patents. So Huawei and other Chinese companies have dramatically increased their participation in these international standard setting organizations, the most important of these organizations being 3GPP, or the Third Generation Partnership Project. 3GPP got its name because they initially were created to establish global standards for the third generation network. And they've been establishing standardized technical specifications on every generation since then. Essentially, what they do is they make sure through these standardized technological specifications, they make sure that technology remains interoperable around the globe, not just in one country, but that you can go to Europe, you can go to Asia, you can go wherever you want, and your phone and your network is still going to be operable. And one example, I mentioned that Huawei and other Chinese companies have increased their participation in these organizations, and that some of their tech has been adopted as the global standard. And an example of that is channel coding. So what channel coding does is it mitigates the effects of errors in a communication link caused by interference or device impairments. And so Huawei developed a novel code to correct this type of errors, known as polar coding. And so now polar coding has been adopted by 3GPP as the standard, the global standard for the 5G network. Another very important international standard setting organization is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is part of the UN. And essentially what the ITU does is that it ensures all nations allocate the same spectrum range for 5G. So we talked about how 4G used the lower end of the radio spectrum, and that 5G is going to be have a more comprehensive use of the spectrum. And so ITU's primary function in the 5G realm is to make sure that all nations are on the same page as far as what radio spectrum they're allocating for the use of 5G technology. Moving on to perceptions, Chinese perceptions of cyberspace. I skipped over national intelligence law. The national intelligence law in China is very important and has actually contributed to a lot of the tensions between US and China at this point. The national intelligence law in China was adopted in 2017. And it says that all organizations and citizens shall support and assist and cooperate with national intelligence efforts. So this caused widespread concern, especially with Huawei's involvement in the 5G infrastructure construction, that Huawei is going to use its access to the network and technology to provide intelligence to the Chinese government in accordance with this national intelligence law. Huawei has regularly asserted that they would refuse to cooperate with Beijing. However, some experts argue that these statements actually show how closely Huawei must be working with the government to be able to exercise such open defiance. So in response, the US called for a global ban on Huawei, and several nations have banned Huawei from their 5G infrastructure and networks. And in the United States, it resulted in Huawei being added to what is known as the entity list. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of US specific participation in international standard setting organizations. So moving on to China's perception of cyberspace, just a brief overview. It's critical to have at least a basic understanding of these fundamental differences between our nations and how we perceive the challenges and threats of cyberspace. So based on my research, I found two main concepts that seem to be predominant in China's perceptions of cyberspace, and those are cyber sovereignty and mutual strategic trust. So cyber sovereignty is this concept that essentially the UN Charter's sovereign equality, principle of sovereign equality, should be applied to cyberspace. Sovereign equality means that all nations, regardless of traditional measures of power or size, deserve equal treatment and respect of sovereign rights. So some, in the context of cyberspace, some believe that cyber should be a free and independent domain controlled primarily by private individuals and corporations. However, others, such as China, believe that it should be controlled by nation states who can determine what information is and is not available to their citizens. So we have the US policy, which is that cyberspace and the internet remain open, interoperable, reliable, and secure. And we have China's policy, which focuses on this concept of cyber sovereignty and focusing on information control and preserving the government's interests. Mutual strategic trust is essentially where both sides of a negotiation, both sides of a relationship are aware of each other's strategic purposes while holding positive expectations of each other's positions and actions on issues of vital interest. So this does not mean total disclosure of priorities and prerogatives, but it does entail an expectation that conversations are going to be sincere, that they're going to consider mutual benefit for each side, and that each side is invested in a healthy long-term relationship. So over the last few years, our relationship in this mutual strategic trust between the US and China has degraded severely, making it difficult to develop a meaningful relationship. And this is demonstrated also by the lack of high-level interaction between our governments in regards to cyberspace and cybersecurity. So these two concepts are essential just to have as a baseline when we're talking about cyberspace and the impacts on our relationship with China. So the current status of the cyber response, first I'm going to talk about the biggest overarching international response that we have to cyber, which is the Budapest Convention, which is an international treaty. It's the only agreement regarding cybercrime at this point. It came into force into 2004. There are currently 65 member states. Most of those are Council of Europe members as well, but there are 21 non-Council of Europe states that are members of this convention, including the United States. China is not a member of the Budapest Convention at this point. In order to join the Budapest Convention, you have to have an invitation, you have to have unanimous consent of Council of Europe members that are party to the convention. And if you are a non-Council of Europe state, your invitation expires after 5 years. The convention requires member states to adopt domestic legislation to criminalize certain computer-related offenses and also to establish general principles for mutual legal assistance and international cooperation. This treaty has been accused of being a failed treaty due to there are only 65 member states as opposed to the ITU, for example, which has upwards of 190 members. However, the Budapest Convention has managed to create a framework where a significant number of states, despite not agreeing on what's a definition for cybercrime, a significant number of states have agreed to certain actions that constitute cybercrime. And as such, the Budapest Convention has formed the framework for many nations' response to cybercrime and the threat posed by cyber. Currently, there is a proposed additional protocol to the Budapest Convention in an attempt to make the convention more relevant. It's been 15 years since more than 15 years since the convention was passed. So the main elements of the additional protocol are to increase mutual legal assistance, increase direct cooperation between nations, extend trans-border searches, and increase rule of law and data protection safeguards. So on the next slide, we'll talk about some actual issues that I've pointed out with the proposed additional protocol. Those primarily revolve around Articles 4 and 5 of the proposed protocol. And then we'll also talk about the proposed Russia-China cyber treaty right now, which is being researched right now, which focuses on internet censorship and cyber sovereignty. In regards to our domestic structure and our current cyber response, for risk management and supply chain security, we've had several federal government actions to try to protect our supply chain, including the National Security Strategy to Secure 5G, the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which was established by statute to identify and recommend supply chain risk management standards, guidelines, and practices for executive agencies. We also had Executive Order 13873, which was securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, which essentially the president invoked his authority under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to authorize the Secretary of Commerce to prohibit ICTS transactions involving foreign adversaries which pose an undue or unacceptable risk to national security. The 2019 NDAA also prohibited government agencies and military entities from contracting with companies that use Huawei technology. For our federal organization, we have at least 8 federal departments and several law enforcement agencies that play a significant role in cybercrime investigation and prosecution. The newly created Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, was recently created to lead the national effort and understand and manage cyber and physical risk to our critical infrastructure. And then the 2021 NDAA created the position of National Cyber Director. Very briefly on our cybersecurity laws governing private corporations. Essentially, we have a handful of federal disclosure laws that require corporations to provide notifications depending on the scope and severity of the breach that they've experienced. However, every state has their own scheme and their own set of laws. So the US essentially, we have more than 50 different sets of disclosure laws that companies have to sort through and figure out how to adhere to. Overall, there's very little incentive for businesses to cooperate with law enforcement. Since 2011, only 106 companies have reported incidents to the Security and Exchange Commission. So breaches are drastically underreported to the federal government. But it is extremely important to fold these private sector entities into our overall cybersecurity plans. Obviously, today, our private sector plays a huge role in our critical infrastructure as a nation. And an attack on private industry could cause catastrophic damage to our critical infrastructure. So it is essential that the federal government figure out and develop a way to fold our private sector into our overall cybersecurity plan. So we're going to move on to some of the solutions that I proposed in my thesis. We'll start with some reforms to the Budapest Convention. First, I addressed the proposed China-Russia treaty. There are 3 big issues with this new proposed treaty. First is that there's a general prohibition of activity for criminal purposes in cyberspace, but criminal purposes is not defined. And several human rights organizations have already filed concerns and worry that this proposal could be used to criminalize what we would consider as ordinary online behavior, like criticizing governments, advocating for human rights and racial equality. The new treaty also has a provision that requires member nations to curb the dissemination of information that inflames hatred on ethnic, racial, or religious grounds. And as we saw when the US initially did not join the Christchurch call to prohibit online extremism, which was issued by New Zealand, the US, our Constitution, the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of association. So while a discussion of the incitement standard and true threat standards are beyond the scope of my paper and this presentation, the test to prohibit speech in US jurisprudence is very difficult to meet for this type of call. So we have some constitutional issues there in the new proposed treaty for the United States. The third issue with this new proposed treaty is that it calls for international governance of the internet by sovereign states, which would essentially eliminate private participation in private companies. This would be an unprecedented level of government oversight, and it goes against the US's current policy, which is to work with private corporations to ensure the freedom and openness of the internet. One of the biggest concerns also, aside from these potential rights violations, aside from those three provisions that I just discussed, it's essentially a duplicate of the Budapest Convention. So it would be an enormous waste of international resources to try to push through a new treaty that's essentially the same, plus some very controversial and untenable provisions. These resources could instead be used to assist nations in developing cyber defenses and the global ability to fight cybercrime. With the additional proposed protocol I mentioned previously, Articles 4 and 5 should cause some concerns. I propose that the additional protocol should be delayed at this point, and that delaying this protocol is necessary, hopefully to give China and other nations who are not currently members of the Budapest Convention an opportunity to join and provide input on the additional protocol. And the current draft of the additional protocol includes some concerning provisions, which would most likely just completely prevent China from ever joining at all, and should even give pause to US authorities. So for the first point, Article 4 requires broad disclosure of information between member states. So information sharing is, of course, essential when fighting cybercrime, but we can't lose sight of potential civil liberty violations. And this article, as proposed, would allow sharing of subscriber ID information, payment information, what type of communication service was used, physical address, as well as IP addresses. So this is a very broad category of information that would be disclosed under Article 4 of this proposed additional protocol. Additionally, Article 5 requires member states to give immediate effect to orders for information from other member states. So essentially, there would be no need for direct contact with the host nation in order to share this information. This is extremely progressive. It would increase information sharing. And it's actually very similar to the Cloud Act, which has recently been negotiated between the United States and the United Kingdom. However, it took years for us to negotiate this with one of our closest allies. And so it's not, I argue, it's not feasible to implement this on such a wide global scale at this point. The Budapest Convention should set the floor for this mutual legal assistance and allow nations to increase their information sharing through bilateral treaties with each other. So instead of this additional protocol, I propose that the US should try to delay the adoption of this protocol and instead propose an amendment to the membership protocol of the Budapest Convention as it stands. So as I mentioned previously, the convention requires that new members have to be invited by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. They have to be admitted by the unanimous consent of Council of Europe members, and they have to accept the invitation within 5 years if they're a non-Council of Europe member. So these membership criteria, I argue, impose an unnecessary and onerous burden. Convention membership should instead follow the UN membership protocol, which is an internationally accepted standard. And it should also eliminate the preference for Council of Europe membership. Currently, for UN membership, an applicant must present their request to the UN Secretary General. There's no invite required, they just request to join. And they state, the applicant states that they accept the obligations of the UN in their application. The Security Council and the General Assembly then consider the member and vote on admission. In the Security Council, we need 9 out of 15 votes with no veto, and the General Assembly is 2/3 of the body. So no unanimous consent either. So for the convention to be truly global, it has to open up the dialogue and expand its membership. And this may seem like a simple gesture and maybe unnecessary, but it could be a powerful gesture. Instead of being invite only like a secret club, you're allowing nations to submit a request for themselves and make this decision for themselves. The Council of Europe might oppose this amendment. They're the ones who drafted the convention. They probably want to maintain that hold over it. However, the purpose of the Budapest Convention is to be a global treaty, a global fight against cybercrime, not a regional treaty, not a treaty comprised just of like-minded nations. If the Council of Europe really wants this treaty to have that global effect, it needs to expand its membership beyond the Council of Europe and beyond like-minded allies. And we need to ensure that we're setting a global standard to fight cybercrime. So I argue that this proposed amendment would be a simple but effective gesture in accomplishing the original purpose of the Budapest Convention. So moving on to US participation in international standard setting organizations. I mentioned before that when that Huawei was placed on what is known as the entity list, which essentially prohibited US companies from engaging in international standard setting organizations like 3GPP. The entity list essentially bans US companies from sharing technology with corporations that are on the entity or entities that are on the entity list. So participation in 3GPP requires that companies share portions of their technology in order to decide which technologies are going to set the global standard. So when Huawei was placed on the entity list, US corporations saw this as meaning that they were no longer allowed to share that technology at the 3GPP meetings because Huawei was member to those meetings. So American corporations pulled out of these international standard setting meetings, and our participation was disrupted for about 13 months before the federal government amended that rule to allow for participation. Thankfully, COVID had an upside in this area. A lot of the decisions regarding standards in 5G were postponed due to COVID. And so the damage and the decisions that were made without US participation were actually fairly minimal. US companies had already provided input on many of the important aspects that were being considered for 5G infrastructure at that time. And because of the delay of COVID, US companies were allowed to rejoin the discussion before final decisions were made. However, it is essential that US companies like Qualcomm, Intel, and AT&T not only rejoin these conversations, but increase their participation in these conversations. If not, as previously discussed, because of China's control over 5G standard essential patents, China will be in a position to replicate the US's leadership and command of 4G systems in the 5G context. So essentially, especially US corporation of Qualcomm, who is a chipset vendor, which is something that the Chinese have typically relied on the US for. If Qualcomm continues to participate and increases its participation, US companies and Qualcomm will have more control over future upgrades to the network because experts say that once the 5G infrastructure is completed, that it is likely that 6G or even 7G systems will probably rely on the same infrastructure, and future updates will come from software, which is typically dominated by US companies. So it's essential that we continue and increase our participation in these standard setting organizations. Additionally, US government participation is essential to ensuring global interoperability of 5G systems. As I mentioned previously, the ITU unifies spectrum allocation around the globe to ensure interoperability of this technology. But the US recently diverged from ITU standards. The ITU decided to wait until 2023 to decide the spectrum allocation for 5G. But the US went ahead and unilaterally allocated 5G spectrum within the United States. While this was necessary to protect US interests, as other nations like China had already moved forward with some of their allocation, and the US needs to ensure available spectrum allocation and bandwidth for our 5G rollout domestically, and ensure that industry can prep and establish the necessary infrastructure. However, there have been calls for the US to leave the ITU and form essentially a G7-like organization as an alternative. In my paper, I argue that this is not a feasible thing for the US to do. The ITU is an arm of the UN, and leaving the ITU would essentially likely be perceived as a vote of no confidence, not just in the ITU, but in the UN itself. The ITU is a large group, which makes it difficult to make decisions. However, leaving the ITU could cause a permanent rift in the community. China could see this as a power move to try to cement US dominance in cyberspace, and could lead China to pulling out and making their own entity with their regional and like-minded allies. So it could cause a disruption in global services. It would go against the US's policy of open and interoperable and reliable internet services. And so I argue that the US should stay in the ITU and use diplomacy to advocate for our spectrum allocation to be adopted as the global standard to ensure the accomplishment of US policy of an open and interoperable internet and network system. I also propose some reforms to the domestic organizational structure. CISA was recently established, as I mentioned, and I argue that it should be utilized as an even stronger unifying force within the federal government. Essentially, I argued that the CISA director should serve as the de facto cyber coordinator, and that the president should issue an executive order to that effect. Towards the end of my writing my thesis, the new NDAA established the National Cyber Director position, the NCD position. But I argued in my paper that it was too early to create this type of position, and that CISA should be allowed to essentially serve as that unifying factor and ensure that resources are being utilized properly, and that CISA had the ability to get up and running before we add a new entity to the mix. CISA itself is already underfunded, and I argued that the creation of another position and another office would only stretch resources even thinner, and that we should consolidate our efforts into CISA and let them perform the function that they were created to perform, which is national risk management, cyber defense, and security collaboration, assessing threats and incident management, and recovery. So I proposed in my paper that once CISA had essentially cleaned up our cyber efforts, got rid of redundancies, ensure that we were using our resources efficiently, that then Congress should move forward with a more evidence-based approach regarding a Senate confirmed position. And that was originally the 2021 NDAA proposed by the Senate originally proposed this study should be conducted first instead of just creating the NCD position off the bat. However, the version of the NDAA that was adopted created the NCD position. And so now we have a single designated leader who will be controlling and directing our cyber response. And finally, I proposed some ways that we can increase private sector cooperation in cyber. So I proposed a mandatory reporting requirement for data breaches. And there have already been some calls within the Department of Justice to adopt this type of law. Some states have started to adopt mandatory data breach laws. New Jersey is one of those. They require that anytime personal information was or was reasonably believed to have been accessed by an unauthorized person, then that corporation must report the breach to law enforcement. This data breach law that I propose would also shield companies from reporting requirements to customers and investors until law enforcement determines the depth of investigation that's necessary. This would relieve companies from penalties and fines that are assessed by other reporting requirements and give law enforcement additional time to assess the situation. As I briefly mentioned before, the current data breach response for most companies is essentially just to shore up any internal deficiencies and fulfill its obligations of notification. Most companies do not perceive any benefit to reporting to law enforcement right now. The best thing to do is just let customers know, move on, and try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Law enforcement involvement only hinders a company's productivity, eats up additional resources and time, and their assessment is that the likelihood of finding whoever perpetrated this crime is pretty low. So companies believe the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and so they just try to shore up defenses and move on. However, mandatory reporting will help law enforcement track cyber criminals and see trends. Similar to the suspicious activity report under the Bank Secrecy Act, these SARs essentially require a bank to report to federal law enforcement when there's a known or suspected violation related to money laundering. There's a minimum monetary threshold for this, but the only other exception to this reporting requirement is if the bank was robbed when they're going to be reporting to law enforcement anyway, or if they're dealing with counterfeit money, which there's another regulation requiring reporting. So essentially, when we're dealing with money laundering, we've had these suspicious activity reports requiring that law enforcement be informed. And we've had these obligations since the 70s. And so it's high time that we have a similar data breach reporting requirement, which allows the government to spot and analyze emerging trends and patterns, allow them to anticipate criminal behavior, and allow them to just detect and prevent these types of activities. And so I argue that we can increase some incentives, because currently there's really no incentive for businesses to cooperate with law enforcement and to report when it's not required. But I think if we provide more robust victim rights for corporations, ensure that corporations are being treated with respect for their right to privacy, with fairness and dignity, ensure that their right to consult with law enforcement and government counsel is being enforced. These rights need to be robustly applied to victim corporations. And so I argue that FBI cyber units and the FBI, or the federal law enforcement response, should have specific victim assistance programs for corporations, just like they do for individuals, to ensure that those channels of communication are kept open. Additionally, I argue that CISA should be used to help these victim corporations with their cyber hygiene and ensure that they are shoring up those defenses to make sure that they are not hopefully breached again, and provide that additional security. I also propose a potential change in tax schemes, either a tax break or a tax penalty, depending on how people want to go, to incentivize companies to invest in basic cyber hygiene, like regularly patching software, establishing and maintaining high standards for passwords and user information. These are some of the easiest steps that companies can take to avoid data breaches, which will hopefully result in a drop in data breaches and make US companies more secure. So those are my proposed solutions to some of the threats that we are facing in cyberspace right now. And I am happy to take any questions at this point.
Great, thank you, Captain Ken. Really appreciate it. So I want to start. First, I want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please don't feel free to use the Q&A function. In the meantime, I see one question came in, but I'll ask a question first, and then we can kind of sort through those. So in your paper, you propose, and obviously here, you propose amending the Budapest Convention as a potential solution. And by that, I mean adding an easier route to membership. With China and Russia's focus on strengthening sovereignty in cyberspace, do you think it is possible for either of these countries to actually join the Budapest Convention as is, which cedes some of the sovereignty in exchange for the free flow of information?
Yeah, I think it's feasible as long as it's feasible as long as we push off that additional proposed protocol that I discussed. I mean, while Russia and China have clearly more of an emphasis on the cyber sovereignty concept, both nations also have mutual legal assistance treaties that are currently active with the United States. They, recognize on this fundamental level that we have to have some kind of cooperation and some kind of mutual assistance in order to combat this very real threat. So we have negotiated successful mutual legal assistance treaties, but on a limited scale. And so that's why I argue that we should not adopt this additional protocol at this point, because that would those provisions would definitely push Russia and China and other like-minded nations over that line. They're currently not members, but I don't think they ever would be. The chance would be absolutely zero if we pass that additional protocol. So I think it's feasible as long as the Budapest Convention is setting that floor like we've done with the mutual legal assistance treaties that we currently have with Russia and China.
Great, thanks. We do have a question from R. Curtis McNeil. He asks, how do we ensure that suspicious activity reporting doesn't become another breach of individual privacy? I think he's referring to the proposal you had on the last slide, referencing the mandatory reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that with my proposal there, the linchpin is really the mandatory recipient of this information is going to be law enforcement when we have evidence that a breach has actually occurred. So not necessarily providing that personal information to law enforcement, but letting them know how many people have been affected, maybe where the breach is coming from, if we can trace that. Giving them the information that they need to conduct an investigation while still protecting the privacy of individuals. I think the most important aspect is just getting that information to law enforcement to allow them to see trends and to allow them to anticipate and discover some of these higher threat, more organized and sophisticated crime entities. But absolutely, that would still have to be a concern, ensuring that people's personal liberties are not being compromised by this type of reporting requirement.
All right. So along those lines, you propose a potential requirement that all businesses have to report either intrusions or potential intrusions within 24 hours. I did some quick research. It looks like Senator Warner actually introduced a bill that's pretty similar to that. It would require all federal agencies and covered entities, so anybody that does business with the federal government, to report any cyber intrusions or potential intrusions within 24 hours. How is this different? So I elaborated a little bit on it. How is it different than what we currently have, the scheme of laws that we currently have requiring reporting of potential intrusions, and how would that benefit U.S. national security?
Yes, I think one of the biggest differences is that U.S. reporting requirements right now they typically don't have a timeline. It's usually, as soon as, without unreasonable delay is some language that we see. Sometimes they'll have a 30-day requirement, but usually it's a reasonableness standard. We don't have such a strict timeline. And what the benefit that would have for national security law, I'll just draw some comparisons. I mean, in China, there's been a data breach reporting requirement since 2006. The EU's new notification requirements give companies 72 hours to report, but still sets a very truncated timeline for that reporting requirement. And so the international community is handling data breaches in a way that allows them to combat cybersecurity threats on a national scale. And so I think having a similar truncated timeline for US reporting would allow the US to similarly combat cybersecurity threats on a national scale. The mandatory reporting requirement will allow increased data collection, will allow law enforcement to spot trends, and will create a more secure environment for not just the federal government, but for American businesses and American citizens. And so I think having that kind of reporting requirement and information availability will increase our ability to defend ourselves and will help our national security efforts.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the biggest, if I can comment, I think the biggest frustration is the actual obligation is somewhat amorphous. I mean, first you have to have that it actually affected some kind of consumer data, right? It has to affect somebody's data. And the second is you have a reasonable time to report that. So if you think about it, if I'm a business, the first thing I want to do is I want to take time to assess whether or not it actually affected consumer data, right? Individuals' data. And so I get a little bit of lead time, and then I get more lead time because that's be a reasonable time after that. And so I think we saw with Equifax, I can't remember the exact timeline, but I want to say something like 45 days to 60 days. That's a long time to be sitting out there. And as you suggest, that sort of creates problems with evidence and being able to assess exactly how it happened and to reconstruct the crime scene, the digital crime scene, as it were. And so I think a 24-hour reporting is a great step in the right direction. Now, kind of switching gears, you earlier mentioned the ITU and all the options the U.S. has with regards to the ITU. And one of those options, you said that the U.S. should use diplomatic means and incentives to create a global buy-in for its spectrum utilization plan. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I'm unfamiliar with that. And can you elaborate on how that is a benefit to the United States?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the ITU put off determining the global spectrum allocation plan until 2023. And so in the US, we've already begun allocating radio spectrum frequencies to 5G. And so when you're talking about the interoperability of technology, if you have American devices that are operating on a certain frequency, and then you have devices in Europe operating on a different frequency that was allocated by the ITU, those networks won't be able to talk to each other, and you won't be able to go to Europe and use your phone because you're going to be using a different frequency, different type of communication with the network towers. So essentially, in order to effectuate the US policy of having this interoperable and global interoperability of our networks and technology, because the US has already begun this spectrum allocation, it is essential that we use our clout and authority and influence in the international community, in the ITU itself, and the UN, to encourage buy-in for the ITU to adopt what we have begun as the global standard. This unified allocation plan, again, is essential to the global interoperability of 5G technology. And so if we want US devices and US technology to operate properly outside of the US, it's essential for us to make sure that we are working with our allies or working with the ITU to get this buy-in, to ensure that the spectrum allocation globally tracks with the spectrum allocation that we've begun in the US.
Right. So another question I had, so you advocate, obviously you sort of tongue-in-cheek advocated against creating the NCD, the National Cyber Director. Obviously that the position was created by Congress earlier this year and filled, I believe, in June or July. Have you seen any positive steps? So you obviously saw some potential negatives. Have you seen any positive steps taken by this position over the last 3 or 4 months?
Yes, sir, absolutely. So in June, we had Chris Inglis, who was appointed and confirmed as the National Cyber Director. And so the position is obviously very new. There have, in practicality, been very few formal powers given to the NCD at this point. But one of the biggest ones that he has right now, and one that I advocated for in my paper, is that the NCD is responsible for reviewing agencies' cyber budgets and evaluating their spending decisions. And so that was one thing that I argued for pretty strongly, was ensuring that we are cutting out inefficiencies in our spending, that we are, and that instead of these redundancies and these overlaps, that we are investing we're making new investments, shoring up our defenses. And so that's one of the things that the current NCD has been authorized to do, to review these budgets. And he's made statements about how he's going to take care to highlight investments that we should be making and that we're currently not, while simultaneously cutting out those efficiencies. He's also talked about working with CISA in order to help agencies who are victims of breaches to recover quickly, using CISA to help shore up their own defenses, and ensuring that agencies know that they are now accountable for their own cyber defenses. The NCD and CISA is going to help out, but it's not just their IT office that's accountable for their cybersecurity. These agencies need to take a more hands-on approach. So while the office still lacks permanent funding, we're still working on building a team and getting staffers for the NCD. It seems that he's doing a fantastic job of laying that groundwork and establishing the investments that we should be making in unifying our cyber response.
Great, Captain Kent, thank you so much. I see there are no questions, and so I guess seeing that we're at 55 minutes, I wanted to thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was very informative. In particular, I loved reading the paper. It was a very good read. It's a very long read, but it's a very good read. It covers a lot of what you discussed in greater detail. So I encourage everybody, when that's published, we'll send out a link so you can actually read the full paper. Thanks everyone for attending. Yep. So yeah, Mr. McNeil asked if they could potentially get the full paper. Yes, as soon as it comes out, as soon as it's published, I believe it's going through the publication process now. And as soon as it's published, we'll send out a link to that. So thanks everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on the 27th of October. We're going to have Professor Michelle Hanlon from the University of Mississippi School of Law present on national legal aspects of space flight participants and space tourism. So we hope to see you all then. Thanks so much and have a great Air Force Day.